Hello everyone, today we talk about the Battle of Brunanburh, fought in 937 between Athelstan, King of England, and an alliance of Olaf Guthfridsson, King of Dublin, Constantine II, King of Scotland, and Olwain, King of Strathclyde. So this is one of the most important, if not properly the most important battle in Anglo-Saxon history after Hastings. It's considered properly the cradle of English identity, in a sense. It passed down history in an important number of sources. Very few are actually from the time. Many, around 40 for later, for some centuries fundamentally, are concentrated, at least agree on the magnitude, right, of the clash, properly in terms of men involved, of losses, because this was fundamentally an English victory that delivered on the Allied enemy a devastating defeat and properly a number of killed. And that is considered, in spite, as we will see, unfortunately, of the relative poor documentation. Well, yeah, it's really poor, but we will see what are the historical problems here. But for the reconstruction today, we make naturally a battle video, so it's a tactical analysis, and it is considered properly to have amounted to this much. It is properly to the consolidation of the Kingdom of England as such, right? This battle basically spared England to receive a devastating blow in a moment of otherwise, solid, rule from the side of Athelstan, that in this regard also speaks for his victory, right? And as a cause, broadly speaking, so a success properly of the monarchic model and the surpassing, let's say, of the heptarchy, at least ideally, let's say, in the sum of Anglo-Saxon powers that had struggled in these times of crisis, like since the beginning, as essentially a non-unitary system that surely had maintained an idea of itself as properly this Germanic system that had to expand in an imperialistic fashion, fundamentally, in the rest of the British Isles. And the Battle of Brunanburh is also showing this, because especially of Athelstan British policy, and that otherwise would have, England would have fragmented once again, with the Celtic Norse presence in Britain would have spread further and shifting much south the boundary with England proper, and we would have probably witnessed a very different history. So there is a huge background to describe, if one wants to be precise, but given that we just make a tactical analysis, I will skip part of this, because we will fundamentally be reading two sources, right? We'll give a bit of also historiographical background, of course, but it gets down to two. One is essentially the poem Battle of Brunanburh in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. That is properly a contemporary source, written, if I'm not wrong, 20 years after the battle, and that provides us with, if you want properly the mentality of what an Anglo-Saxon celebratory poem was about this battle, what was meaningful for them, important for them, essentially praises the deeds of the Englishmen against their foes, etc. And there is properly an idea from this source of Englishness emerging, right? It's difficult to address. Now we will explain why this aspect is so important, because one would think that this is just a nationalist boutade, right? And it is surely also used like that, like most history, unfortunately. But if you properly frame the battle in its political and social background, and even in the military logic, chiefly from a strategical point of view, you properly understand what the united Anglo-Saxon reason of this success. Right here, we don't have time to digress. You know more or less what I think about civilization and how it is built. Anglo-Saxon England was a more advanced political and social system compared both to the Norse, the Hiberno-Norse that participated chiefly at this battle, and the same Scots right at that point. And this battle proves the organizational capacity of let's call it properly a kingdom under attack, right, and also starting to fragment, because basically, as we'll see, the Allied invasion of the same England brought seemingly even certain Anglo-Saxon noblemen from their side. Was here the creation, the force of Athelstan. As you know, he was descendant of Alfred the Great. He had this important Wessex legacy, together with Mercer, that figure, in fact, in these accounts as the distinctive character of this, had brought to some discontent, as well as always does, right? But it proved in this battle its effectiveness, its success, right? This thing stuck together, this system, whatever it was, stuck together, right? And from an Anglo-Saxon base, it proved that the system worked, and that the majority of the moral forces of England stood from the side of the monarchy. So this is particularly important to me. Right, this goes beyond even what we can think of the Vikings, their activities of other, interesting powers, such as, for example, Scotland, that also had an important, was gradually, but naturally lagging behind compared to England, but still, creating its own power. Even the Hiberno-Norse were essentially, were clever in exploiting these situations. They were worried themselves because, objectively, same Anglo-Saxons had pressured them, Athelstan had essentially forced, even militarily, to receive the submission of Scotland, of extending this power in a mindset that was properly, in 10th century England is properly of imperialistic nature. It was an idea of imperium. Athelstan's coins properly show the Rex Totius Britanniae, which means properly that he was, that was their vision, that they were the rulers of the whole Britain and beyond, in a sense, right? This concept expanded at some point. Even later sources, this mindset came to encompass ideally even Norway. Like there was this kind of, that was kind of realistic at that point, but still it was properly the horizon through which the Anglo-Saxon kings were starting to look at this reality. The main problem we have with the Battle of Brunanburh is, you see, in popular culture, as far as I understand, in Britain, it's all about the battlefield. Like, apparently, this battle has surely received a bit more of attention lately, but it's not like one of the most famous, at least. But as far as I understand it, it's. I mean, of course, for anybody who has some historical understanding knows the relevance of this battle. It was for real, like the most important in Anglo-Saxon history up to that point and up to its end with Hastings, no doubt. But it's mostly a problem to locate its battlefield. And I maybe I will disappoint some in this regard, but I will not explain the extremely long and, at the end of the day, still speculative, fundamentally, reconstructional problems that we have where the battle was fought. I can just say that the most likely, or at least the best hypothesis we have, it's not even likely in my opinion, is that this battle was fought at the Wirral Peninsula in the northwest of England. And that's it. That's as far as I want to say, because the sources, unfortunately, do not provide us with reliable information about this. It's conjectural, right? It's a broader reflection. There are tens of places that have been proposed as the battlefield of Brunanburh. As far as I know, there are certain groups in the very last years that have carried out some important archaeological work privately, as far as I understand, and that they claim that they may have properly spotted at Wirral the battlefield, what they think the battlefield is. So it's if it is so, it's fantastic. But I think that even just with the historical information at our disposal, we simply can't tell that, even if it was true. And we mostly have our sources that we can't read all, because as we were saying before, there are like 40, but there are two ones. One we already said, the Battle of Brunanburh, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. The other one is Snorri Sturluson, so 13th century, much later, but still relevant, Egill's Saga, which is very rich in information. Tells basically about a battle fought by Egill and his brother Thorolf, as basically these were Norwegian Vikings who were at the service of Athelstan, as would be normal at the time. That provides with actually a lot of information for a battle that it's generally believed to be properly Brunanburh, even if it bears another name in the account. And actually the editors of the properly the last editions of Snorri of Egill's Saga actually date this battle before Brunanburh, right? Some time actually before. So it would be another one, and that's literally how few we know and how speculative this whole thing really is. Because as we will see, the Battle of Brunanburh in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle doesn't quite provide us with much of a tactical information. Egill's Saga actually does, right? And it's fascinating. And the whole debate is essentially, how true Snorri Sturluson's account is regarding the events of a time that was probably, in the early 10th century, but not necessarily even the same battle, but just suspiciously similar sounding, at least. And that's really the best we have, right? And that's how poorly documented the thing is. But at the same, and so because you see, most of the speculations about the battlefield have been drawn also properly from Snorri Sturluson's work. So that's how vague the whole thing is, how hypothetical altogether is. What I care about is to mostly read these accounts to see what properly and respectively the mindset of a 10th century Anglo-Saxon poet and one of a 13th century skald can say at this point, writing down the Norse sagas like the Icelander Snorri was, right? And what was considered probably, it's after all like 300 years of distance. It's a lot, but it's not that the world had changed dramatically, especially militarily speaking. Yes, a lot of things had happened. So, but the internal coherence of the the narrative is important in my opinion. Yes, there are things you can't dismiss. There are some mistakes, some evident topoi in the story, but it's not bad. And in my opinion, it's worth reading just to have an idea of what the context, the environment, the background of the Battle of Brunanburh, however, wherever was fought, could be like, right? And this is important because if you get very often like you see, if you encounter this battle described in a disclosure in book, in a synthesis, in a sum, I don't know, medieval battles, things like that, and there is not much history behind that, just know that the tactical description is based on Snorri Sturluson's work, right? That's the core. We have something else. There are interesting sources like William of Malmesbury, for example, in the 12th century, that is considered a reliable historian, and however is pretty distant from the events. Albeit, his monastery was the same burial place of Athelstan. There was all tradition regarding the king, this extraordinary battle, that sense of Englishness we were talking about before, and the author claimed to have found an old book that told the story of the battle, and he gives this other account. Is simple in its own regard. It matches a little bit with Snorri's one at some level, says this plain, this heat where the battle was fought. He tells the interesting thing about the strategical situation that seems to be pointed to the fact, as also Snorri says, that the king had to first gather his forces while England had already been invaded, and some Anglo-Saxons were passing from the enemies, the Celtic Norse side, but properly, Snorri's account is the only one that tells properly a concrete story of the battle, and which allegedly took place in, as we will see now, in 2 days. The story is told from essentially Egill's, Skallagrimsson's perspective. So, but it provides enough information about Athelstan, about all of that. Makes like it basically sums up the figure of the Norse Gaelic king of Dublin, and still also Constantine II of Scotland in the wall story. So that's the mistake. But altogether, the story is interesting, and in my opinion, it's not even so fictionalized for the sake. The same thing has been said, for example, for the poem of the Battle of Brunanburh, saying, well, you heard this narrative experience, it's a tall boy, etc. Yeah, but just exactly because all poems were written in a similar way at the time, well, it's likely that all battles were kind of fought more or less in that similar way, and we know, in fact, also from a military point of view. So sometimes the literary skepticism, because of the copy, is not quite, a valid reason to discard these accounts, which I found personally very interesting. So to give a little bit of background in here, so we already addressed, I guess, the main point. The northern half of Britain was at this point a sort of patchwork of Viking, British, and Gaelic-speaking kingdoms. Right, there were Norse rulers in York, Dublin, and the Hebrides. Strathclyde, the old British kingdom in southwest of Scotland and Cumbria, was a melting pot of peoples of Irish, British, and Norse ancestry. Scotia was the name of the Kingdom of Scotland, was this still vaguely defined area covering mostly central lowlands, the richest areas, and also, however, much of the old Pictish kingdoms in the east. The King of Scotland here we've seen is Constantine II of the House of MacAlpin. That was, together with the Egill-Norse, the main actor of the alliance against Alfred's grandson Athelstan. So as we've seen, Athelstan essentially wanted to unite the whole Britain, namely under the House of Alfred. And at least to contain, if not defeat, the Viking threat. Now, this was wishful thinking from a practical point of view, but ideologically speaking, internationally speaking, now a victory could properly demonstrate the renewed Anglo-Saxon power in this regard, even accepting a formal subjugation surely brought positive practical results in favor of the Kingdom of England. And Athelstan had managed to evict the Viking king of York, and this consequently also isolated the one of Dublin, and also essentially by obliging the kings of Scotland and of Strathclyde to pledges of friendship, properly an alliance, was a way to cut out the Gaelic-Norse even more from the rest of Norse activity around Britain. So the first to waver for this system was properly Constantine II, who decided that he had been fundamentally oppressed enough by this policy. He married his daughter to Olaf of Dublin. Olaf was a pagan, so Athelstan was very, also from a political, ideological point of view, wanted to stress the illicity of such marriage or these things. Athelstan at this point had also received the submission of the Welsh princes, making them pay an annual tribute, and so the picture here was complete. Naturally, the longer this state would be maintained, and the weaker the Celtic Norse area would have grown. Right. Conversely, with an Anglo-Saxon defeat, things could be reversed. So consider also that Celts and Scandinavians here didn't like each other at all. Right, so they had been all fighting basically against each other in this picture. It was just a brutal struggle from competition. Yes, they were mixed in the sense that, as we know, the important Norse influence, properly from an ethnic point of view, in Scotland, in the same Ireland, of course. But all these powers, politically, I mean, were one against the other. So basically, the hatred towards Athelstan was the main glue here for their alliance. Constantine's son had been taken as hostage back to England after Athelstan campaign in the north. It had pillaged Scotland, etc., and obliged its king to submit. And the Celts and the Norse put together an impressive alliance. This was a bit like the northern world, reacting to the southern English expansionism and influence all over in the region. Therefore, here here would be very complicated to reconstruct through all the sources properly all the movements of the army. Right, the idea behind this campaign was naturally to enter into Anglo-Saxon territory, to gather forces also along the way, the same Anglo-Saxon rebels fundamentally against Athelstan, and to deliver this blow to his monarchies and to fundamentally to fragment English power into something that could at that point could have been penetrated and influenced by the Norse and the Celts. Would have been really a very different story, right? This, as we will see, this was a great Anglo-Saxon victory from a tactical point of view, also strategically and politically, but it didn't bring to the subjugation of the whole Celtic Norse area at all. But it factually prevented concretely Anglo-Saxon England to receive a very important structural blow that would have sensibly weakened its reality. So as you can imagine, and especially this is quite evident, especially in the Norse, in the Celtic worlds, were lots of adventurers that were joining the Allies' coalition just for the sake of loot, right? Here, something that I don't know how much the sources altogether stress, but surely the idea of Athelstan powers in that regard, and consequently of his kingdom, is on the fore, is that this enormous coalition of Celts, Norse, was surely much more fragmented than the Anglo-Saxon army, right? So this was a very important element, right? Properly, the lack of a unity of command, not just because it was like the Scots plus the Gaelo-Norse, but properly because even these powers individually didn't have a concrete, a structured, systematized power, military organization like the Anglo-Saxons had developed in the past centuries. So this discontent is exploited. That is evident, as we will see also from Snorri's account, to probably also in the same field, even not just politically, but primarily, right, from that point of view, but properly to disorder the enemy before the battle. And that's properly the political and social background we were talking about before, right? The Allies were there for the loot. Most of their war bands were there. The Anglo-Saxons were fundamentally defending their own land. At this point, with a military organization that we discussed, I made multiple videos on the Anglo-Saxon military. I also created a playlist named English Warfare, so you can go check that out if you're interested in it. The numbers of the armies are also a bit of a mystery, right? This, first of all, the time, we don't know what it was fought exactly. Some people say August, September. We know that Olaf was still dealing with a minor war in Ireland by August. Some say September, others say even early October, right? So there is also some pressing here put by the season. As you understand, possibly Athelstan was both, counting on that, but also properly waiting for his own men, right, to gather, which, as we've seen in the Anglo-Saxon war, it took a while, but it could be properly a maneuver. Even naturally, the more the enemy entered its own territory, the more damage and the least trust towards monarchy this was causing in England in general. So that was the balance, more or less. Armies probably numbered in their thousands, right? Is it possible tens? Possible, right? It's it would be probably a big deal if there were more than 10,000 per side, but it's still possible. I don't think they would reach 20,000 per side, but surely they were in the range of 1,000. This was an impressive force put all together. All the sources, you see, the older sources do not provide much detail, but what was important for them, and that we should listen very carefully as modern people, is that this battle was remembered as the largest one that had occurred ever, right, from Anglo-Saxon memory. Also the Celtic sources basically say how terrible and large it was. It was the big thing. It was remembered as the big battle, right? And presumably everybody knew also at the time when it was fought. Just they didn't think it was important to tell us because it was known at the time. They didn't reason in much long-term standards, let's say. At that point, for them it was important that it was the big battle, not a battle like the many others also had been fought, renowned also between the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings, and so on, and the Celts, and so on. We know that Athelstan summoned what was effectively the Anglo-Saxon levy, right? The Anglo-Saxon army in a national sense, in this regard. With him was his half-brother Edmund, who would later succeed him, and two royal cousins, Elfwin and Ethelwin. Importantly enough, the clergy were well represented as well. There were at least 3 bishops at the battle, including Versan of Sherborne and Theodred of London. There is also a tradition from later sources that says that Odo of Canterbury essentially saved the battle by providing Athelstan in the fight with a new sword. These details are important because it tells you that how all England was represented, how much consensus there was around the monarchy at that point from the lay and the clergy alike. Right, so this is an important political indicator also for the military, for the cohesion properly that stood behind the Anglo-Saxon army, which is probably the main reason why they made it. And according to Egill's Saga, Athelstan was also served by this force of Vikings under Egill and his brother Thorolf Skallagrimsson. More of them later because we'll see it in detail. So we just, I don't know, can we guess like a number how large at least the English army was? We could say maybe 7,000, 8,000 armed men, which means also other people, field aides together with them. It's an impressive force for those times. Sanders. William of Malmesbury, 200 years later writes something like 100,000 men, which of course it's impossible, but it still means that surely the Anglo-Saxon army was at its largest at that point, according to tradition. And if he, you see, there are certain things about William of Malmesbury chronicles that people said, because it's believed to have been fabricated in some sort, and then people said, but there wouldn't be negative remarks about Athelstan in a fabrication like that, because essentially, as we've seen, the king is criticized in account because he waits before facing the enemy. It actually makes sense from a political and strategical point of view, as we've seen before. And just because somebody invents a story doesn't mean that doesn't have to fit something strange at the time. Like, we are underestimating medieval minds at intelligence in that regard. We just don't know, because we have no evidence of the late source that William found and of which he based his account. But anyhow, so I would pass directly to the poem of the Battle of Brunanburh. Right, that is brief, but it's very indeed artistic and evocative. And consider this is a 10th century source, so it's as if, the people who fought in that battle were alive at the time. So I'm using a translation from Suzanne Hayter. You can find online for free. And there is also the original Old English text, so if you want to check that. But so, in this year King Athelstan, Lord of Earls, ring-giver to man, and his brother also, Prince Edmund, eternal glory they won in battle with sword edges around Brunanburh. Shield wall they split, they hewed battle shields of linden, with the leavings of hammers, the sons of Edward. It was only befitting their noble descent from their ancestors, that they in battle often against hostile ones their land defended, treasure, hoard, and home. The enemy perished, Scotsmen and seamen, fated they fell. The field flowed with blood of warriors, from sun up in the morning, glorious star gilded over the earth, God's bright candle, eternal Lord, till that noble creation sank to its seat. There lay many a warrior, by spears destroyed, northern men, shot over the shield, likewise Scottish as well, weary, war-sated. West Saxons went forth the entire day. In troops they pursued the track of the hostile people. They hewed the fugitive from behind grievously, with their swords sharp from the grinding. The merchants did not refuse hard hand-to-hand combat to any warrior. They with Anlef over the sea surge, in the bosom of a ship, sought land, fated to fight. 5 lay dead on the battlefield, young kings, by swords put to sleep. Likewise also 7 of Anlef's earls, countless of the army, sailors and Scots. There took to flight the Northmen's chief, by need constrained to prow of ship. With a little troop he pressed the ship afloat. The king went out on the dusky flood tide. He saved his life. Likewise there are also the aged one through flight came to his own region in the north. Constantine, hoary warrior, he had no reason to exalt the great meeting. He was of his kinsmen bereft. Friends fell on the battlefield, killed as strife, and even his son he left in the place of slaughter, with wounds ground to pieces, young in battle. To boast he had no need, the grizzled-haired warrior of sword slaughter, old deceitful one. No more did Anlef, with their remnant of an arm. To laugh they had no reason, that they in deed of war were better in battlefield, collision of banners, encounter of spears, encounter of men, exchange of weapons, when on the battlefield with Edward's sons they played. Departed then the Northmen in nailed ships, dejected survivors of the battle, on the sea of storm, over deep water, Dublin they sought, back to Ireland, ashamed in spirit, likewise the brothers both together, king and prince, home sought, West Saxon land, from the battle exultant. They left behind them the corpses to enjoy, the dark-coated one, the dark raven, horny-beaked, and the dusky-coated one, the eagle white from behind, to partake of carrion, greedy war-hawk, and that grey animal, the wolf in the forest. Never was there more slaughter on this island, never yet as many people killed before this, with sword's edge, those who tell us from books, old wise men, since hither from the east Angles and Saxons came up, over the broad sea. Britain they sought, proud warsmiths, the Welsh they overcame, glorious warriors, they took hold of the land. This is beautiful. I will not comment it because it's more or less, it says, you see here the most important points. You see, tactically speaking, there's not that much. It tells at some point that the enemies had been killed from shot over the shield, things like this. We don't know how, but it's obviously plausible, either projectiles or the same, an overarm spear. It's not even important, right? Here we see the honor, the pride, the sense of the moral superiority, like of the warriors of England, of the Anglo-Saxons, of Wessex, of Mercia, over the Northmen, the seamen, the Scots, the Welsh. And you see here the national bias here. You start understanding that they believed that at the time as well. So it's important, right? Because this is an original source of the time, to stating properly these concepts, and it is properly here the pride of England being paraded. There is Constantine's son is killed. So many are other, important Celt Norse noblemen, and it's just beautiful, dreadful. The most beautiful part to me is when he speaks of the raven and of the wolf, right? And banquet over the corpses of the enemy. It was very important because the enemy fled in shame, right? The Northmen went back to Ireland in shame. This is the idea. You can imagine the moral devastation. We have seen this in von Clausewitz, how it's not even the actual dead people. It's here that how the moral desolation spreads, like properly the panic, the shame, the idea that you have made this big thing wrong. You lost. It's something terrible, because the responsibility of those dead people, of the enormous cost that this thing had altogether for your own community had failed, right? So this poem is worth anything else we know about this battle, because it tells us literally what was in the mindset of these people, right? At least it can give us a grasp of the actual aspects that we're concerned of. And it's really a beautiful piece of Old English literature. Consider from the Irish perspective, from the Annals of Ulster, that are also very old, close to the event, that this written, the battle, the struggle was, quote, immense, lamentable, and horrible, and desperately fought. Several thousands of Norsemen who are uncounted fell, but a large number of Saxons fell on the other side, right? If I'm not wrong, it's this source. No, it's the Annals of Climax. It's another Irish source that provides us the most complete list of the dead. It talks of 34,000 killed, right? This is also an exaggeration, but for an Irish source to properly point this out and to provide the name of the fallen, right? So this included, for example, Selach, that was the son of Constantine, Gabakan, the Norse king of the Western Isles. They also had, these were basically forsaken Christians that had switched to allegiance to the Vikings, right, from the Western Isles. That there is a hell of a military tradition in there. That they had participated, their king being killed. Another fallen was Owen, the king of Strathclyde, and two sons of Sithric, the erstwhile king of York. So here, some big guys of British politics fell, right? And this is very important. It gives you the magnitude that these indicators properly make reliable the news of the bloodshed, of the bloodbath, right? So for this man fallen were lots of others from their ranks were slaughtered as well. But as we have seen also, the Anglo-Saxons seem to have suffered a lot of losses. Athelstan's two royal cousins, Elfwin and Ethelwine, are registered among the dead. Also 2 bishops, including Versten of Sherborne. Also 2 unnamed eldermen and lots of other people, according to the source. Also, William of Malmesbury refers of the, quote, pitiable slaughter polluting the air with a foul stench. You can imagine what a battlefield would be like after 1 or 2 days in terms of, of smell. There are some interesting comparisons. Even here, some national bias emerges from both sides. From Celt and Saxon side especially. Don't have much of Norse voice because these were still Norse leaders of Celtic people. So the main thing was between the Celts and the Saxons, really. But it's being believed that Athelstan's victory also was very closely won, first of all, and it was kind of a Pyrrhic one. So much that, in fact, after this victory didn't lead, as we were saying before, to the northern subjection to the Anglo-Saxons. Also, after Athelstan died, the Anglo-Saxon influence over the north, the decrease. Olaf, that outlived Athelstan, also launched a raid in England, to England at some point again. So, but as we were saying, we're talking about 10th century Britain, so you can't realistically think that England had the capacity to subjugate, literally, from direct control, all those lands, right? If this is the result of such a great battle, well, you can think in a great Anglo-Saxon victory. You can imagine if the outcome had been the reverse. It would have been even worse for England. So, thankfully for them, it didn't happen. So I would pass to Egill's saga that describes the Battle of Winnet. That is what we think it might have likely been, or maybe not so likely. We don't know properly. Brunanburh. It tells the story of the Viking hero, anti-hero, warrior, poet, berserker Egill Skallagrimsson, right? And it's told from its own perspective. So this is a long text, very topic and rich in details, etc. As you understand, many of these are fictional. I will comment it directly every time I find something worth saying. I hope that this doesn't ruin the read, but also this text is easy to find in translation online. I entrust to translation at this point because I don't have the linguistical and philological competence to translate. The original sources require really an important skill, but I presume this is a good one. I hope so, right? At least it makes sense from a literary point of view. So simply go. So, of Athelstan, King of the English. Alfred the Great ruled England, being of his family the first supreme king over England. That was in the days of Harold Fairhair, King of Norway. After Alfred, Edward his son was king in England. He was father of Athelstan the Victorious, who was foster father of Acon the Good. It was at this time of our story that Athelstan took the kingdom after his father. There were several brothers, sons of Edward. So the source does make some historical mistakes, but here we're evaluating the battle and the prodromes to it from a political and strategic point of view. So that's what we really care about at this point, because otherwise we know how the history really went about this macro, fact, let's say. Then he goes on and says, but when Athelstan had taken the kingdom, then those chieftains who had before lost their power to his forefathers arose in rebellion. Now they thought was the easiest time to claim back their own when a young king ruled the realm. These were Britons, Scots, and Irish. King Athelstan therefore gathered him an army and gave pay to all such as wished to enrich themselves, both foreigners and natives. just pretty realistic, just in the way these armies, especially in Viking times, England would be levied, important resources that could be gathered by the English kings, but also money, but they could hire professionals coming from everywhere, etc. The brothers Thorolf and Egill were standing southwards along Saxony and Flanders when they heard that the King of England wanted men, and that there was in his service hope of much gain. So they resolved to take their force thither. And they went on that autumn till they came to King Athelstan. He received them well. He saw plainly that such followers would be a great help. Full soon did the English king decide to ask them to join him, to take pay there, and become defenders of his land. They so agreed between them that they became King Athelstan's men. England was thoroughly Christian in faith, and had long been so when these things happened. King Athelstan was a good Christian. He was called Athelstan the Faithful. The king asked Thorolf and his brother to consent to take the first signing with the cross, for this was then a common custom both with merchants and those who took soldiers' pay in Christian armies, since those who were prime signed, as it was termed, could hold all intercourse with Christians and heathens alike, while retaining the faith which was most to their mind. Thorolf and Egill did this at the king's request, and both let themselves be prime signed. They had 300 men with them who took the king's pay. Olaf the Red was the name of the king in Scotland, so this is not true as we've seen. So the author is mixing Constantine with Olaf of Dublin. He was a Scotch on his father's side, but Danish on his mother's side, and came of the family of Ragnar Hairy Briggs. He was a powerful prince. Scotland, as compared with England, was reckoned a third of the realm. Northumberland was reckoned a fifth part of England. It was the northernmost country, marching with Scotland on the eastern side of the island. Formerly the Danish kings had held it. Its chief town is York. It was in Athelstan's dominions. He had set over it 2 earls, the one named Elfgeir, the other Gudric. They were sent there as defenders of the land against the inroads of Scots, Danes, and Norsemen, who harried the land much. And though they had a strong claim on the land there, because in Northumberland nearly all the inhabitants were Danish by the father's or mother's side, and many by both. So a pretty neat depiction of the Northumbrian frontier, both because of the ethnic background and the harassment of these raiders and so on, and as an avampost of fundamentally of the Anglo-Saxon power. Bretland was governed by 2 brothers, Hring and Adils. They were tributaries under King Athelstan, and withal had this right that when they were with the king in the field, they and their force should be in the van of the battle before the royal standard. These brothers were right good warriors, but not young men. Alfred the Great had deprived all tributary kings of name and power. They were now called earls, who had before been kings or princes. Right? This was maintained throughout his lifetime and his son's Edward's, but Athelstan came young to the kingdom, and of him they stood less in awe. Wherefore many now were disloyal who had before been faithful subjects. That this is beautiful, as this is extremely insightful actually, because it really shows the nuisances of Anglo-Saxon kings, especially a young one like Athelstan, in a story to to maintain the loyalty of its subjects, and in particular of this men that had been stripped of their previous power, in favor of the monarchy. So naturally, as you know, succession is always a politically delicate moment, and also these kings had to prove properly in arms to be able to defend their kingdom. So this was the political thermometer that the author is is beautifully actually outlining. So of the gathering of the host, Olaf, King of Scots, so again, this is not true, but still, drew together a mighty host and marched upon England. When he came to Northumberland, he advanced with shield of war. On learning this, the earls who ruled there mustered their force and went against the king. And when they met there was a great battle, whereof the issue was that King Olaf won the victory. But Earl Gudrek fell, and Alfgeir fled away, as did the greater part of the force that had followed them and escaped from the field. And now King Olaf found no further resistance, but subdued all Northumberland. Right? Is this historical? We don't know precisely, right? Because we have no idea. Literally, we think concretely that the Scots actually moved. Set on March before the Gallo-Norse. They rejoined eventually after having probably invaded England already. In fact, yeah, separately, right? So to imagine the political, logistical coordination, these are important aspects to recognize from an organizational side of the Allies. Then, and of course, because there were local lords that were there in the name of the king. Or some would pass to the enemy, others would fight, be destroyed. So imagine all the violence, the destruction, and the plain, cruelties that war unleashes. So Alfgeir went to King Athelstan and told him of his defeat. But as soon as King Athelstan heard that so mighty a host was coming to his land, he dispatched men and summoned forces, sending word to his earls and other nobles. And with such force as he had, he at once turned him and marched against the Scots. But when it was bruited about that Olaf, King of Scots, had won a victory and subdued under him a large part of England, he soon had a much larger army than Athelstan, for many nobles joined him. Right, so this was becoming kind of a civil strife as well among the Anglo-Saxons. And on learning this, Ring and Adels, who had gathered much people, turned to swell King Olaf's army. Thus their numbers became exceeding great. All this when Athelstan learned, he summoned to conference his captains and his councillors. He inquired of them what were best to do. He told the whole council point by point what he had ascertained about the doings of the Scots king and his numbers. All present were agreed on this, that Alfgeir was most to blame, and thought it were but his due to lose his earldom. But the plan resolved on was this, that King Athelstan should go back to the south of England, and then for himself hold a levy of troops coming northwards through the whole land, for they saw that the only way for the needful numbers to be levied in this time was for the king himself to gather the force. So you understand the preeminence of the king in England, properly, for the military success, his personal investment in the organization of the force, his authority, his properly reliability from the subject. This is understood by Snorri, and it's also it's present also in William of Malmesbury, indirectly at least, account given this time lapse between the Allies' invasion of England then and the mastering of the English army. As for the army already assembled, the king set over it as commanders Thorolf and Egill. Right, so this is being debated. So first of all, we should point out, I forgot, that we think that in spite of the combined force, the fragmented nature of the Allies' army, probably it was Olaf of Dublin to be in command of the wall, or at least it was a split command with the King of Scotland, but still, seemingly it was the Gallo-Norse to have the the upper hand. It's just an impression as far as I understand, but sources altogether, even here, the mix of, yeah, it's the Scots here, but the head is Olaf, so maybe just a hint of that. And also this fact that Athelstan wouldn't trust part of his army's command to these Vikings that had come just, according to the source, just in autumn, so already by now late September at least. So even for the timing of the battle, it could be an interesting information. But it's not considered so reliable, right? Because who are these guys? Like, it's obvious that there were Vikings in the Anglo-Saxon army at this point, but that these individuals that are the heroes of the story would gain so much ascendancy on Athelstan to gain, as we will see now, even the command of a part of the army itself is not credible. Albeit we should also say, against skepticism, that it's possible that Vikings would be arrayed all in one section of the army, would be commanded by the same Vikings, right? So we just have no clue of the proportions of Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings, etc. Now we will gather that Thorolf and Egill basically commanded 300 men, right? So it's not an enormous force, but seemingly was an elite one, right? And there is some evidence of this, even in this text, not just because the guys are the heroes. So yeah, I mean, it's credible considering these were professionals too. So it happened in other contexts historically in the same Middle Ages. Very often I've met them many. That, of course, if you have foreign mercenaries, well, these will be commanded by their own leaders. So it's not so strange as some criticism has pointed out. So they were also to lead that force which the freebooters had brought to the king, but Alfgeir still held command over his troops, right? So here it actually says it, right? The Anglo-Saxons still had, the control of their own forces, while the Vikings now were in charge of their own, and of these marauders that had joined the army and that were fleeing. But because that's what the Vikings did in the first place as well. So also was a Viking, technically, because, this is just piracy, essentially. So anybody who would join, even just to loot, not even as an armed force, right? Could be from everywhere. Same Anglo-Saxons, in part, of course. Then further, the king appointed such captains of companies as he thought fit. This is also realistic because, who does guide the troops in the campaign, in the battle? Well, yeah, but presumably was already known, but at a high level, especially the eldermen, these big guys, was more a political thing than a matter of territorial organization. It was rather the Thanes that were entrusted with this territorial control, whereas at the monarchic level, there was some kind of direction of most important noblemen to perform certain tasks, etc., by appointment. Then, when Egill returned from the council to his fellows, they asked him what tidings he could tell them of the Scots king. And he sang, so this is in verse, Olaf one earl by furious onslaught in flight hath driven, the other slain, a sovereign stubborn in fight is he. Upon the field fared Gudrek, false path to his undoing, he holds this foe of England, Northumbria's humble sword. After this they sent messengers to King Olaf, giving out this as their errand, that King Athelstan would fain henazle him a field, and offer battle on Winheath by Winwood. Meanwhile he would have them forbear to harry his land, but of the twain he should rule England, who should conquer in the battle. Right? So this is portrayed in Snorri's, he was writing from the 13th century, still maybe the echo of feudalism, of chivalry existed in these things, but don't think that even in Viking times it wasn't kind of a primal form of that. Naturally, as we will see here, the battlefield is even basically outlined with this hazel, this is if it was a boxing ring or something, right? Of course, that's unrealistic. But here the point is rather that the King of England said, stop harrying my land because I give battle, right? So the idea was that, of course, you mostly devastate one territory to provoke the enemy to battle. The guy says, "I fight you." So if you are confident, this goes beyond chivalry, right? All ethical systems, are built over something more concrete that is actually logical. Do you want to fight? Then show up. Otherwise, those who follow you also will think that you're weak, that you should not come there for complete victory. You can't give them much. And of course, that's what the allies were there for, right? And stop devastating around. And I promise you that who wins shall rule England, right? So the battle for England, literally. So he appointed weak hands for the conflict. So they arranged the stage. And this is also, some criticism says, no, it's not true. Well, this is what was done, actually, right? Especially the larger armies were historically, the most obviously they would set a place to fight. Normally, they literally negotiated that. It's not unreal, right? And even in these times, as primitive as they may seem, but the thing worked the same way. It wasn't always true, right? But even just think about, as we've seen, the logistical effort for maintaining all these men on the field. It was easier to say, okay, let's both get to that point, let's encamp in front of each other, let's see each other's movements, and that naturally here also other factors interplay, as we will see from a logistical point of view. The Anglo-Saxons had hastened the R rate, so they still lacked certain units from certain forces from the country, so they were trying to buy time, right? And they negotiated in the meanwhile. So it's actually very realistic, and I find it so. He appointed a weak hands for the conflict, and whichever first came on the ground should wait a week for the other. So even the timing for eventually saying who won, who lost, because that can also happen. They may have not given battle. There were lots of episodes like this in history, right? Enormous forces gathered, but eventually no battle fought. Now, this was then the custom, Snorri says, that so soon as a king had enhazeled a field, it was a shameful act to harry before the battle was ended. So this is naturally written in a poetic way, but concretely, again, it says something logical. Accordingly, King Olaf halted and harried not, but waited till the appointed day, when he moved his army to Windhill. So the allies are in for battle. North of the heath stood a town. There in the town King Olaf quartered him, and there he had the greatest part of his force, because there was a wide district around which seemed to him convenient for the bringing in of such provisions as the army needed. But he sent men of his own up to the heath, where the battlefield was appointed. So the heath is the plain. Some say it's not necessarily a moor, because these are the problems for spotting, finding the battlefield or these things, and it doesn't matter. It was just a flat land. It was ideal for fighting, and that's in fact where these large armies would mostly negotiate to fight on, for the aforementioned reasons. These were to take camping ground and make all ready before the army came. But when the men came to the place where the field was enhazeled, there were all the hazel poles set up to mark the ground where the battle should be. Well, yes, this is realistic indeed, but not the battle choice and all the revolving movements, decisions. The place ought to be chosen level, and whereon a large host might be set in array, and such was this, for in the place where the battle was to be, the heath was level, with a river flowing on one side, on the other large wood. But where the distance between the wood and the river was least, though this was a good long stretch, there King Athelstan's men had pitched, and their tents quite filled the space between wood and river. So to give you a picture of battlefield here, basically the allies were coming from the north and the Anglo-Saxons from the south. So the author says that the battlefield was this plain on the long on the north-south axis, right? And so in the east, on the right, you had a river, and on the west, on the left, you had a wood, right? And it says that the armies were so large that basically they occupied the whole width of the battlefield in the upper ends. Basically, they in the extreme ends, north-south ends, and that behind them, they had some habitated areas, a town, some think maybe the same Brunanburh, doesn't matter practically, and where they set camp, and they probably were on a ridge, also because the author here says they had so pitched that in every third tent there were no men at all, and in one of every three but few. Yet when King Olaf's men came to them, they had their numbers swarming before all the tents, and the others could not get to go inside. Athelstan's men said that their tents were all full, so full that their people had not nearly enough room, but the front line of tents stood so high that it could not be seen over them whether they stood many or few in depth. Now this is being interpreted as if probably these armies were on a ridge. This plain was in the midst, was kind of like a valley. Well, not a valley, because as we've seen, it was part of a valley in the sense from the on the left bank of the river. But let's say that maybe the camps were elevated. It also could be that the first tents were really that high. So, but it's a matter of interpretation, just so that it would make sense to set a camp in a elevated position in general, right? This is of no tactical interest for the account eventually, but still here mostly for the ruse, for essentially for the Anglo-Saxons to fake their to bluff on their numbers at the beginning, and showing the Celt Norse that the Anglo-Saxons were more than what they actually were, because the Anglo-Saxon reinforcements were yet to arrive, right? So the Anglo-Saxons trying to buy time. But according to the source, the Allies buy the situation. In fact, Olaf's men imagined a vast host must be there. King Olaf's men pitched north of the hazel poles, towards which side in the ground sloped a little. Why this thing of the poles, etc.? Well, we've spoken of this chivalric mindset, but it's also, as we will see, because this is a heroes. It's like a tournament, right? The heroes are the protagonists, so there is this kind of chivalric mentality behind the description. It's like a sport fundamentally, and war was seen as a sport. This is what we have to understand, because for the leaders, at least, that were imbued with the sense of, in fact, of themselves, of aristocratic, ethos and so on, that they shared even with the enemy, right? So this is the broadly the cause of the detail. Then, from day to day, Athelstan's men said that the king would come, or was come, to the town that lay south of the heath. Meanwhile, forces flocked to them both day and night. Right, so they were still, gaining the full stream of reinforcement. But when the appointed time had expired, then Athelstan's men sent envoys to King Olaf with these words: King Athelstan is ready for battle and had a mighty host. But he sends to King Olaf these words, that he would fain they should not cause so much bloodshed as now looks likely. He begs Olaf rather to go home to Scotland, and Athelstan will give him as a friendly gift 1 shilling of silver from every plough through all his realm, and he wishes that they should become friends. So this is a huge sum. Right, 1 shilling of silver essentially for every man in the kingdom. So, this was the Anglo-Saxons trying to boast a power that in a wealth, in a security, and a confidence that they had not. Right, but since they knew that the enemies were in for the loot, like this tribe, it seemed like a very good deal. Naturally, the source exaggerates it. It's not realistic to presume that this was the actual offer. But as we will see here, it's a bit the topos of the for buying time. We don't know how historical it is. This is also being criticized. But anyhow, this happened also in other contexts. So why not? Surely there were negotiations before the battle, because as there always are. So, when the messengers came to Olaf, he was just beginning to make ready his army and purposing to attack. But on the messengers declaring their errand, he forbore to advance for that day. Then he and his captains stayed in council, wherein opinions were much divided. Some strongly desired that these terms should be taken. They said that this journey had already won them a great honor if they should go home after receiving so much money from Athelstan. But some were against it, saying that Athelstan would offer much more the second time, were these refused. And this latter counsel prevailed. Then the messengers begged King Olaf to go back to King Athelstan and try if he would pay yet more money to ensure peace. They asked a truce of 1 day for their journey home, another for deliberation, a third to return to Olaf. The king granted them this. Right? Aside from the specific offer we read from the source, but it's possible. Right? It's possible that the Anglo-Saxons said, here we're risking literally the kingdom to be destroyed. This is real, right? And so there was probably some offer. That is to say, at that point, what was Anglo-Saxon policy also with the Vikings in general, at some point at least, tributes was the normal international way of diplomacy all over the world. So yeah, let's avoid this bloodshed. I give you a lot of money. This is a credible thing that the Anglo-Saxons would require. And in the Allies' camps, the thing was refused because it said, this is a lot of money, very generous. We can't ask for more, otherwise we're going to battle. Then we don't know if this realistically was also because the Anglo-Saxons were yet to gather their troops, but that's also realistic actually. So might this have happened as a back and forth negotiate? Yeah, why not? Why not? So the messengers went home and came back on the third day according to promise. They now said to King Olaf that Athelstan would give all that he offered before and over and above for distribution among King Olaf's soldiers, a shilling to every freeborn man, a silver mark to every officer of a company of 12 men or more, a gold mark to every captain of the king's guard, and 5 gold marks to every earl, which is, And then the king led this offer before his forces. It was again as before. Some opposed this, some desired it. In the end the king gave a decision. He said he would accept these terms if these two were added, that King Athelstan let him have all Northumberland, with the tributes and dues thereto belonging. Again the messengers asked armistice of 3 days, with this further that King Olaf should send his men to hear Athelstan's answer whether he would take these terms or no. They say that, to their thinking, Athelstan will hardly refuse anything to ensure peace. King Olaf agreed to this and sent his men to King Athelstan. So this is it was realistic, because if the Allies had won the battle, probably Northumberland would have, Birmingham would have become a frontier city at that point. Northumberland would be basically overrun, as the source says that it had already been, at least in this context, this work. It's a way of securing essentially the conquest that the same invasion had achieved. So this is also realistic. This speaks kind of strategic sense, right? We can't doubt of the ruse whether the Allies actually could be tricked by the Anglo-Saxon tents. That sounds a bit fictional, but we have to think that they were both strained. They had both invested so much in this campaign. They had a huge army. It costed a freaking lot. It's not just about it's the military risk and the political and social cost of this mobilization, right? So negotiates are normal in this circumstance again. Then the messengers ride all together and find King Athelstan in the town that was close to the heath on the south. King Olaf's messengers declare before Athelstan their errand and the proposals for peace. King Athelstan men told also with what offers they had gone to King Olaf, adding that this had been the counsel of wise men, thus to delay the battle so long as the king had not come. But King Athelstan made a quick decision on this matter, and thus bespake the messengers. Bear these my words to King Olaf, that I will give him leave for this, to go home to Scotland with his forces. Only let him restore all the property that he has wrongfully taken here in the land. Then make we peace between our lands, neither harring the other. Further be it provided that King Olaf shall become my vassal, and hold Scotland for me, and be my under king. Go now back, said he, and tell him this. Now this is how you want an Anglo-Saxon king to speak. And that's where he reveals, right? Here, the thing is that he felt confident enough. Enough of his troops had gathered, so he says nuts, essentially. And at once that same evening, the messengers turned back on their way and came to King Olaf about midnight. They then waked up the king and told him straightway the words of King Athelstan. The king instantly summoned his earls and other captains. He then caused the messengers to come and declare the issue of their errand and the words of Athelstan. But when this was made known before the soldiers, all with one mouth said that this was now before them to prepare for battle. Right, so there was no other option. The messengers said this too, that Athelstan had a numerous force, but he had come into the town on that same day when the messengers came there. So these towns were distant, as we will see, because it's basically 1 day of March, because so they were not literally on the floor of the heath, right? Were some distance. This is important, as we'll see now when we talk about the fight. So there were still like some, I mean, you can imagine runners, spies all around to check each other's movements, and you can imagine the confusion, the chaos, the information that was more or less reliable. It's not easy to spot what an enemy force is about in this context. Then spoke Earl Adels. Now, methinks, that has come to pass, O king, which I said, that ye would find tricksters in the English. We have sat here long time and waited while they have gathered to them all their forces, whereas their king can have been nowhere near when we came here. They will have been assembling a multitude while we were sitting still. Now this is my counsel, O king, that the two brothers ride at once forward this very night with our troop. Maybe they will have no fear for themselves, now they know that their king is near with a large army, so we shall make a dash upon them. But if they turn and fly, they will lose some of their men, and be less bold afterwards for conflict with us. The king thought this good counsel. We will here make ready our army, said he, as soon as it is light, and move to support you. This plan they fixed upon, and so ended the council. So basically here they decide to the Allies decide to move before the English royal army proper arrives on the field. So this is an important moment because they can seize it at some level. And while there are still some Anglo-Saxon forces, as we will see, also the Viking ones of Thorolf and Egill. So there is basically this two vanguards of the respective armies that they confront each other, and that they are basically on the move to eventually come to the battlefield themselves and to fight. This is important because they work a bit as vanguards properly in the properly testing each other on the field. That is to say, if we manage to through these vanguards to inflict considerable damage to each other by maybe wiping the enemy one out, well, that can already say something about the eventual outcome of the main clash. So it's already something, and it's a way to just also preserve ourselves. That is to say, things go clamorously wrong, and this the outcome of the clash between the vanguards spread so much, terror in the defeated side that lowers the morale, sinks, etc. Well, we will probably, not even fight at that point, and maybe try to save the situation in some other way, right? Of course, if we're a retreat from the losing side, with the Allies maybe coming back where they came, for the Anglo-Saxons to return their homes to defend them in the face of the enemy offensive. So yeah, it could be a thing like that. So on the fight, Earl, Ring, and Athos, his brother, made ready their army, and at once in the night moved southwards for the heat. But when day dawned, Thorolf's sentries saw the army approaching. So here the Vikings were on the fore, right? The main Athelstan army was still in the town, a day of march behind. Then was a war blast blown, and men donned their arms, Selex spirited, and they began to draw up the force, and they had 2 divisions. Earl Alfgeir commanded 1 division, and the standard was borne before him. In that division were his own followers and also what force had been gathered from the countryside. It was a much larger force than that which followed Thorolf and Egill. So this is interesting because basically you see that the Earls, Ring, and Athos were Anglo-Saxon brothers that had defected Athelstan, right, at the moment of the Allies' invasion. So also they were a bit expendable from the Allies' side, but also proving their loyalty to the invaders in case of victory would have been rewarded. So a bit here, they're a bit freelancers, let's say, but not properly. That would be mostly Thorolf and Egill from the Anglo-Saxon side as Viking mercenaries, right? And also here the Earl Alfgeir is sent in the vanguard, the Anglo-Saxon vanguard proper, together with the Vikings. This makes sense because it's a participation of elements that already tells something about properly the Allies that were, maybe at this point were less confident they had been before for sending these okay, they wanted maybe to test the loyalty of these Anglo-Saxon earls to their cause. The Anglo-Saxons sent in for the Vikings that are relatively expendable, and they're also good force, right? And also an Anglo-Saxon representative in the west of the Earl Alfgeir, right? So it's important. So here there's a description of this. This is so you understand. These are just the vanguards fighting. The main armies are not there. Yeah, but they are on the plain, so that's important as a first fight. Thorolf was thus armed. He had a shield ample and stout, a right strong helmet on his head. He was girded with the sword that he called long, a weapon large and good. In his hand he had a halberd, whereof the feather-formed blade was 2 ells long, ending in a 4-edged spike. The blade was broad above, the socket both long and thick. The shaft stood just high enough for the hand to grasp the socket, and was remarkably thick. The socket fitted with iron prong on the shaft, which was also wound round with iron. Such weapons were called mail piercers. So this is important because it tells you here the heroic ethos of the champion, right? A Viking hero that is equipped with the best panoply to kill properly. To pierce mail, that is to kill the elite, right? So to confront with the leaders and then technically to smash there. So there's a lot of individualism in here, as you understand by default, but also some technique, some capacity that already is reflected by the professional character of these bands, etc. It's not just about it's a bit in between. We talk about Scandinavian armies during the Viking era and how the gradual process of civilization from the tribalistic, individualistic ethos to the collective, kind of larger, almost royal one in certain cases. At the end of the period process. Egill was armed in the same way as Thorolf. He was girded with the sword that he called Adder. This he had gotten in Courland. It was a right good weapon. Neither of the two had shirt of mail. This is interesting as well. There's some evidence. I was looking today at some from Cumbria and from Ireland, at the same time showing champions in the 10th century. It also appeared to be without mail. Part of the reason being that these areas were, by European average, somewhat depressed. So that even in Ireland, mail was something fundamentally extremely rare, would keep being for a very long time, right? And so in the north, in these areas also, the I don't know, Northumbria, these areas, you wouldn't find much material wealth. Vikings, as professionals, would be more likely, properly as mercenaries, more likely armored, right? But still, it was possible to prefer like less weight and less protection in favor of more agility and more and less and more resources, more physical resources to spend in that sense. Here we don't know what the reality was, right? Tendentially, what you don't see much in despicable series such as Vikings, etc., is that these guys were constantly armored most of the time, especially the leaders, right? And they had helmets, mail, etc. But still, yes, there were some typologies of fighting that were also corresponding to this myth of bravery of individual. Still, as we have seen, somewhat individually indisciplined reality that, however, had a purpose in a warfare, was still relatively on a contained scale, and for which these heroic figures still played an important part. This is a saga, right? So it's a novel. It's based on historical events, but this may be a detail that has been altered for fictional purpose, but we just don't know. Then they set up their standard, which was borne by Tofit the Strong. All their men had Norwegian shields and Norwegian armor in every point, right? This also tells you what the standard actually was. It's more realistic. And in their division were all the Norsemen who were present. Thorolf's force was drawn up near the wood. Alfgeir's moved along the river. So the allies wanted to surprise the Anglo-Saxons with their vanguard in the early morning. Instead, the Vikings here are to be found in the Anglo-Saxon army already ready to match them. They are the ones who are actually advancing along the river. In fact, then Snorri says, early Egill and his brother saw that they would not come upon Thorolf unawares, so they began to draw up their force. They also made 2 divisions and had 2 standards. Egill was opposed to Earl Alfgeir, Hring to the freebooters. So you see, this is a single line, right, from both sides, split in two divisions each, and they confronted each other frontally. Some said, here there are too many numerical correspondences, whatever, but this was done, right? They knew what they were facing, especially in this more contained number, so it's not so strange. Yes, there is some numerical, as we will see, correspondences in the story that seems a bit topic, but it's not implausible altogether. So the battle now began. Both charged with spirit, right? So these first clashes, first charge that is aimed at crushing the solidity of the enemy line, but they held both. So this meant they were both valuable formations, and Earl Egill pressed on hard and fast till Alfgeir gave ground. So here the allies are having the battle over the Anglo-Saxon part of the vanguard. Then Egill's men pressed on twice as boldly. Right now, it was long before Alfgeir fled, and this is to be told of him that he rode away south over the heath and a company of men with him. He rode till he came near the town where sate the king. Then spoke the earl, I deem it not safe for us to enter the town. We got sharp words of late when we came to the king after defeat by King Olaf, and we will not think our case bettered by his coming. No need to expect honor where he is, right? Because consider that Alfgeir had already been defeated in Northumbria, so he had been defeated again. So this was a way for Athelstan also to test again whether he had, appointed the right man in Northumbria, and also relying on this, and that's why he was, expendable, but also probably he was giving him a chance to demonstrate his virtue. Then he rode to the south country, and Hovis travelled. This to be told that he rode night and day till he and his came westwards of Earlness. then the Earl got a ship to take him southwards over the sea, and he came to France, where half of his kin were. He never after returned to England. So Alfgeir was completely shamed by his failure. Right, you could fail once in Northumbrian phase of the major invasion, that you were given the possibility by the king to face the enemy in combat in the vanguard, like in a single fair, let's say, clash between units. Defeated again, you're done for. Right, go back. Yeah, he went to France even. Right, so this is a ruinous retreat, whatever. And Adils at first pursued the flying foe, but not far. Then he turned back to where the battle was and made an onset there. This when Thorolf saw, he sent that Egill should turn and encounter him, and bade the standard be borne that way. His men he bade hold well together and stand close. So this is important because it's a bit what would happen, as we'll see, on a larger scale, albeit reverse in the major clash. The problem naturally now is that the Anglo-Saxon, Adel, the Anglo-Saxon leader from the Allied side had broken the Anglo-Saxon division in the enemy vanguard, and now could fall on the other one from the rear, from the flank, where he's still engaged in combat. So basically, Thorolf tells Egill, look, watch that, go against them, prevent that to happen. And Thorolf also said, move we to the wood, and let it cover our back, so that they may not come at us from all sides. Right, so it's a dramatic situation, because here actually the guys had seemingly not been engaged yet in combat, however, they were risking to be, and so they said, let's move to the wood and let's defend there. It's kind of a desperate situation, because technically it's preferable, of course, to fight in open field, right, where you can deploy deliver your force in a much more rational, direct, coherent way. But at that point, if you are attacked from the side, that's definitely, you're gonna lose. They realized it, so they say, okay, let's make this resistance in the woods, where at least it's more like 1 versus 1. If we can, if you are superior against them like that, right, or if they have need to take us out of there, we can make up this stand. They did so. They followed along the wood. Fierce was the battle there. Egill charged against Adils, and they had a hard fight of it. The odds of numbers were great, yet more of Adils' men fell than of Egill's. Right, so this is like, what happened in this wood if Real was playing butchery, right? Then Thorolf became so furious. These two guys were berserkers in the story, so they were Viking berserkers, like kind of getting, high in fury, literally, and then. So first that he cast his shield on his back, and grasping his halberd with both hands, bounded forward, dealing cut and thrust on either side. Men sprang away from him both ways, but he slew many. Thus he cleared the way forward to Earl Hring's standard, right, and then nothing could stop him. So that's where a berserker comes out handy. Like, you are in desperate odds. You want to make this individualistic stand on a probably favorable terrain, in the sense that if they had entered the wood before the enemy, they'd taken the best spot. But at this point, things were probably going bad. In spite, Egil's had killed more men of Adels, but they were still taking important losses, and as we've seen, they were probably at inferior numbers, etc. So Thorolf decides to go full berserk and to enter the enemy ranks and take the other enemy earls' standards, right? And he slew the man who bore the earl's standard and cut down the standard pole. It's very important, because the enemy would be disoriented. Say the banner for the center falls, you don't know where your men are. You think that the enemy has reached as far as the safest position in the unit. The one that's of the not really safest, but one guarded by the best man. So if somebody had taken down the standards because some dreadful force has been unleashed there, and that's ideally a single man, right, doing the thing, but it's important from a psychological point of view. And after that, he lunged Thorolf with his halberd at the Earl's breast, driving it right through mail coat and body so that it came out at the shoulders, and he lifted him up on the halberd over his head and planted the butt end into the ground. So he had the guy freaking impaled, right? And that's also what this weapon was functional to, piercing through the freaking guy's body and mail, and sticking the freaking thing on the ground and leaving this guy impaled in front of his man. So you see, he took down his standard. He rose the freaking corpse of their commander to see. So that's a sight, right? And the obvious psychological aim of that is to make everybody in the enemy rank freaking the hell out. And there on the weapon, the Earl breathed out his life inside of all. Inside of all. This guy was meant to lead them. This guy is impaled in front of you. He expired. He dies in front of you, both friends and foes. So this giving confidence also to the Vikings. Then Thorolf drew his sword and dealt blows on either side, his men also charging. Right, many Britons and Scots fell, but some turned and fled. Right, so but Earl Athels, seeing his brothers fall, right, so Hring's division collapses. Athels, as we've seen, units had already fought, so also they were spent, probably had also partially pursued the enemy. So here they were probably very good men, right? This Northumbrian nobility was tough, right? They were half Norse themselves in bracket military culture. They knew what the deal was, so they were tough guys, but were also exhausted. Yet they, here it says, Athels, seeing his brothers fall, and the slaughter of many of his force and flight of some, while himself was in hard stress, in fact, turned to fly, and ran to the wood. Right, into the wood fled he and his company, and then all the forces that had followed the Earl took to flight. Thorolf and Egill pursued the flying foe. Great was then the slaughter. The fugitives were scattered far and wide over the heath. Earl Athels had lowered his standard, so none could know his company from others. But this is full victory for the Vikings. So they managed to kill, like basically with this individual action of Thorolf that takes out the enemy commander. One division is broken, the other was also probably very, very exhausted, right? We've seen Athels was in hard stress, Snorri says. The Vikings managed to hold their ground and to actually massacre the enemy completely. And Athels, during the flight, doesn't even raise his banner, right? He lowers it so that nobody could even distinguish him in the fleet. So meaning that he was scared, right? And that's a dishonor, right? Because he had his standard, so he hadn't lost it, but he equally didn't want to be spotted so that somebody would pursue him and kill him on purpose. So this is interesting, and these are the things that they looked mostly at. Right, he could have won on against the Anglo-Saxon division, but in his own regard now, so he might have been courageous, brave, whatever, good at command at least. But now he was dispirited. His brother's being killed in front of his eyes, and he said, I don't want to even risk to be killed myself. I can't imagine the stress, the violence, but still, that's what these men were trained to sustain, and the fact they would not accept it was a sign of shame, of a responsibility in front of their men and their community. And soon the darkness of night began to close in. So basically this is the first day of fight. Thorolf and Egill returned to their camp between the vanguards, and just the King Athelstan came up with the main army, and they pitched their tents and made their arrangements. A little after came King Olaf with his army. Right, they too encamped and made their arrangements where their men had before placed their tents. Then it was told King Olaf that both of his earls, Hring and Athels, were fallen, and a multitude of his men likewise. So this first day showed essentially that the Anglo-Saxons had a gained a moral advantage, right? And it's meaningful that according to the story, these the two main armies were approaching already during the day of March, right? So without having known of the outcome of the vanguard clash before, right? Because as we've seen, it was also very hardly fought, and so this may still mean not that necessarily there was much more time there for negotiation. They had come to fight, but still that both sides maybe were confident enough they would make it. So the presence of the vanguard tells us that they wanted to be at least a bit cautious, and this outcome naturally favored the Anglo-Saxons and gave something to think to the allies, right? Consider that even the loss of these men in combat, it's kind of a draw here, because at least here we have two Anglo-Saxon rebels that one is killed, another retreats, but at least is alive. From the Anglo-Saxon side, you have actually the land. Elger was the Earl of a lost region, right? So even for the eventual political balance of the control of Northumbria and the lands that the Allies had invaded at this point, according to the story, well, the Allies had also lost this kind of an important earl that they could use locally to maintain its control. So, and his men as well. So consider this man controlled their own land. So this in insight would have made more difficult to control Northumbria proper, or maybe it would have been easier if you think that these were taken out, but still as local political competitors. But it's unrealistic that Northumbria would have been completely integrated under direct, Scottish rule. It's just at that point an important leader and his men of this land had been massacred. So even locally in Northumbria, it wasn't good news for further political stability. So war is that disruptive, but here the moral advantage is gained by the Anglo-Saxon after the clash with the vanguards. So the death of Thorolf, the fall of Thorolf. King Athelstan had passed the night before in the town whereof mention was made above, and there he heard rumour that there had been fighting on the heath. Probably, as we've seen, this combat had unleashed spontaneously. The Allies wanted to catch the enemy by surprise, but actually they were counter-moved. This probably happened in the proximity of the heath in terms of who decided whatever. So it's realistic that both armies kind of didn't know, or maybe that didn't even expect these vanguards to have fought in the first place at some level. It was just maybe to check the movements of the enemy army so that they could get there in time enough. This is important because, so even camping on the heath probably was not feasible. This would have exposed the enemy. So as we've seen, the camps were visible on the extremes. So there was enough time, let's say, through this vanguard to warn as an outpost, basically, to warn the main army of the eventual movements of the enemy on the heath, right, and for and to the camps that they would have attacked. And this is important because these vanguards could halt the advance of the main armies for a while to spend their forces for a day, and then the entire main army would come fresh and maybe overwhelm them. So that kind of makes sense, right? It does make sense overall. This account is somewhat actually very accurate, in my opinion, in terms of military logic. So, Snorri says, King Athelstan, we already said, at once he had all the host made ready and marched northwards to the heath. There they learned all the tidings clearly of how that battle had gone. Then the brothers Thorolf and Egill came to meet the king. He thanked them much for their brave advance and the victory they had won. He promised them his hearty friendship. They all remained together for the night. No sooner did day dawn that Athelstan waked up his army. He held conference with his captains and told them how his forces should be arranged. His own division he first arranged, and in the van thereof he set those companies that were the smartest, right? This is particularly important because normally the best troops in these armies were stationed in the front. I mean, it's not just within the unit as it's normal, but like these are, as we've seen, essentially single lines. Mostly, there isn't much of an in-depth clash. It's mostly about the solidity of the line proper. And in the front, you want the best troops. Maybe there is some further, there are some reserves or something like that, but probably there wasn't much of tactical sophistication in general. But the fact is, he set those companies here. Would be interesting actually to read the original, because it may imply it would be actually more than one line at least. But anyhow, then he said that, but it's still, the sense is, even if there was, is that these first lines were the most important, the ones that were meant to break the enemy. Then he said that Egill should command these, right? And this is also interesting. But Thorolf, said he, Egill, shall be with his own men, and such others I add thereto. This force shall be opposed to that part of the enemy which is loose and not in set array, for the Scots are ever loose in array. They run to and fro, and dash forward here and there. Often they prove dangerous if men be not wary, but they are unsteady if in the field if boldly faced. Egill answered the king, I will not that and I and Thorolf be parted in the battle. Rather to me it seems well that we two be placed there where is like to be the most need and hardest fighting. Thorolf said, leave where the king to rule where he will place us. Serve we him as he likes best. I will, if you wish, change places with you. Egill said, brother, you will have your way, but this separation I shall often rue. So this is interesting because there is a hint here that basically the Vikings division, that also fought the previous day, so these were definitely tough men, were posed in front of, here it says the Scots. As we've seen, the source confuses, like the enemies here are just the Scots, but as we've seen, a prominent element here was made up by the Anglo-Norse, and the fact of the characteristic hit-and-run tactics and skirmishing, etc., is typical rather of the Irish than the Scots in practice. Yes, there were skirmishers in general. The Scots were probably more likely equipped than the Anglo-Saxons altogether in this professional Viking infantry. The numerical bulk of their forces, at least, if this was properly a general levy also of Scotland, it's possible as well. But properly, this idea of the fact that these troops retreat and come back to fight, it's more typically Irish. It existed in Scotland as well, but it's more likely to be depicting actually the Anglo-Norse element. And Egill says, what the hell, like, we are heavy infantry, we're used against these guys here, and Thorolf says, look, Athelstan decided, here's the king, we are working for him, let him decide where we have to fight. And he says, okay, but this is not much of a good, and this is an interesting information because it's a bit incongruent altogether, because if Athelstan had placed, as the source says, the best companies in the front, of course, if these guys were facing the lighter troops, they were the first in the front. But normally, also the enemy fought with some kind of solid front line, right? So, it's still a tactic to go back and forth to annoy the enemy like that in a way. But it's also very exhausting, and you really have to be lighter to do that. So, what does this mean? It means that part of the Allies' formation was composed just by light troops that they couldn't stand the ground, and they would mostly harass just in attacks and feint flights, right? By surprising the enemy like that. This is not clear. right? This sounds just like I don't know. To me, it's irreconstructible properly. There are some hypotheses you can make, but not necessarily the convincing ones entirely. But anyhow, Snorri says, after this they formed in the divisions as the king had arranged, and the standards were raised. The king's division stood on the plain towards the river. Right. So Thorolf's division moved on the higher ground beside the wood. So this is important. You have, as we've seen, this battlefield that goes in the direction north-south. So the Anglo-Saxon army is deployed on the southern end, and the source says that basically Athelstan and his Anglo-Saxons were on the right division towards the river, and that here basically the Vikings all together. So here says Thorolf's division, as if he probably was in control of the whole left of the can we call it Anglo-Saxon army, or the remainder of these Vikings. It's difficult to say. We've seen that there weren't just properly Thorolf and Egill's men, but some also other Mordiers. So it's realistic maybe in numbers that maybe there was this kind of left division, even commanded by these Viking mercenaries. Who knows, right? There's just been some criticism about this. But at least this is how the story goes, and we have to stay to it. So being on the left, also this Viking force was on the higher ground, properly besides the wood, same wood we had where they had fought the day before, and they knew the terrain as well because having fought in there knows something about it, and it's slightly on the higher ground. King Olaf drew up his forces when he saw King Athelstan had done so. He also made 2 divisions, and his own standard in the division that himself commanded he opposed to King Athelstan. So he was on the allied left, right on the river, in his division. Either had a large army. There was no difference on the score of numbers. This is important, says that most of these forces were the same size, which is realistic for such large engagements, because normally that's all where this broader negotiations and problems and where caution was for, right? You have these very large armies that basically are the entire forces of Britain, of the British Isles, actually altogether, almost at least, and they who wins this wins a lot, right? Literally, that's why this battle is so important, and everything, generally speaking, seemed to make the puzzle here, clear, recomposing, right? Sources do say sensible things about this battle. But King Olaf's 2nd division moved near the wood against the force under Thorolf. The commanders thereof were Scotch earls, the men mostly Scots, and it was a great multitude. So, so it says basically that this right was made up by the Scots. So it may mean that in reality, given that Olaf is on the left of the Allies' formations, that's where the Hiberno-Norse were, whereas against the Anglo-Saxons, whereas the Scots met with the Vikings. Could also have been the other way around historically. We don't know, right? It's just that may seem so specifically, because the source here seems to be distinguishing properly of here this right division of the Allies, the one in the woods facing, next to the woods facing the Vikings, that they were Scots, right? So we've seen that there were just Scots here, so maybe it's just a source talking of the army overall. We don't know, but it may be. So is there any military logic to this? Well, if I presume, these armies were very similar, actually, from a tactical point of view. Anglo-Saxons were not so dramatically different in nature, in equipment, and mentality, and training from I don't know, the Norse or the Celto-Norse altogether. There's a sense of Britishness as well in this kind of context. Hell, we have Vikings even among the Anglo-Saxons, so yeah, there wasn't such a huge difference. Of course, you would like to think, I don't know, the Hiberno-Norse being better paid, paired with the Vikings to fight, whereas the Anglo-Saxons more against the Scots. Right? That sounds more seducing. But here we get this information. We don't know how to speak of it. It may be, maybe not. Here the main problem is, as we've seen, that Snorri doesn't contemplate the existence of Constantine as king of the Scots, but Olaf, that is actually the king of Dublin. So in historical reality, so it's impossible to answer this question. So then Snorri says, and now the army is closed, and so the battle waxed fierce. So this is the big engagement of the Battle of Brunanburh. Thorolf pressed eagerly forward, causing his standard to be borne onwards along the wood side. He thought to go so far as to turn upon the Scotch king's division behind their shields. His own men, so basically what the source here is saying is that he wanted to, now we'll see it, to get through basically the allies left and to turn against the enemy left, right, to catch the enemy to fires, basically between the Anglo-Saxons and the Viking one. His own men held their shields before them. They trusted to the wood which was on their right to cover that side. Which is strange, because their wood should have been on their left, actually. So I don't know, maybe this is a mistake in the translation, but there is no doubt about this. The source is clear about who was next to the river. They trusted the wood which was on their right. Well, was on their left, right, to cover that side. It's that simple. All the battle reconstructions talk about this, so whatever. I don't know whether it's a mistake of the translation or maybe an incoherence in the original text. I don't know. So it makes sense, because if the wood was on the left, they wanted to protect their side, right? Like the river was protecting the right flank of the Anglo-Saxons. So the logic here, you understand, it's basically a frontal attack for both, right? So how these armies were mostly conceived. Here we're nobody talks about cavalry, for example. The idea is that these divisions were probably composed of both cavalry and infantry. It's just, that cavalry doesn't have this dramatic fame on British battlefields. People even think the Anglo-Saxons didn't actually fight on horseback, which is nonsense, actually. But surely there wasn't this huge amount of cavalry altogether. The Vikings made important use of cavalry, also the Scots. But it's realistic to think that prevalently that these forces were on foot, right? And they were also very similar to each other in that context. So far in advance went Thorolf that few of his men were before him. So that he was literally leading the advance in a way. So this, according to the source, there should have, normally there were people that were in front of their leader in a way. This maybe as probably for a tactical purpose, because you want to even screen him from enemy attacks and things like that. Also because probably somebody wanted to to say, I'm better than the commander, right? There was a lot of competition among these war bands and so on. But so it was a matter of pride actually for Thorolf, according to the source, to be like there in the front, because it was very courageous to do. But just when he was least on his guard, out leaped from the wood Earl Athelstan and his followers. Haha. So you see what the guys did there. That Athels revealed to be actually shrewd. He had been defeated, yes, so he couldn't probably bear the shame. So he said, okay, you know what, now we'd see what happens to these guys. They brought us to fight in the wood, now we trick them with the woods themselves. And they trusted, so they probably came out of the Viking, on the Viking left flank, right, where the woods were. They trust Thorolf at once with many halberds, and there by the wood he fell. Right, so Thorolf is killed properly by a bit by the surprise, the element of surprise that the enemy have managed to pour out votes against him en masse, and because he had pushed himself too far ahead, alone, right, without enough protection, he's massacred, right. But Thorfinn, who bore the standard, drew back to where the man stood thicker, right. So this is an important detail because even though the commander is killed, Thorolf is killed, but the standard has not fallen because it was carried by Thorfinn, and this comes back where there was more massive troops and therefore gives boosts morale in spite of the loss of Thorolf. Adels now attacked them, and a fierce contest was there. The Scots shouted a shout of victory as having slain the enemy's chieftain. Right, so consider that Adolf's troops, the day before they had been massacred. Right, so we don't know here whether Adolf was actually commanding still Anglo-Saxons, the Anglo-Saxon rebels on his own, or maybe some other troops, Hiberno-Norse, Scot, whatever. It's just here, just for the incongruence we're noting before, who are these Scots? Like, where are the Hiberno-Norse? Like, Snorri calls here the Scots presumably even all the troops of the Allies' army, including seemingly the ones that had, that were under Adels, because, for shouting a shout of victory, having slain the enemy chieftain, it was happening at least on the right division, not on the left. Presumably they hadn't known it yet, right? So maybe this thing is rather that Adels' troops maybe were just some pocket, as for flank attacks you need just a few men, right, to put in crisis the enemy formation. This was something apparently different. They actually caught just Thorolf out there, not much of his men. So it's possible that he had come out of the wood, but as we have seen, the right division of the Allied army was in full sight, right, was not inside the woods. So those are maybe the Scots Snorri is talking about the shout, because they see that Adolf's men have killed Thorolf, right? However, here still, Snorri says properly that Adolf's troops engage with the Viking troops on the Anglo-Saxon left this intense fight. So it's not entirely clear here what are the proportions, who's in the front, who's on the flank, right, and so on. We just don't know. It's just it does sound credible altogether, right? It's just you would imagine what would Thorolf was basically running to go crush the enemy right in front of him. Was just so overly confident he got alone out there. But also the idea is, once you arrive against the enemy lines, what do you do actually? Do you charge alone? This wasn't actually done. Even the pig snout formation wasn't actually a real diamond, a spearhead, because that's the best way to kill literally the best guy who's supposed to break in the front, right? If anything, just by projectiles and so on. So actually, these formations would mostly move slowly against each other, and then maintaining formation until the last tens of meters, and then charging, right, to maintain cohesion and to try to smash against each other. So it's not entirely clear here what's the deal overall. We don't understand the numerical proportion of the divisions. We don't. That should have been, the divisions properly should have been kind of the same size, but here this strange dynamics happen, so we don't really know. Nor we know how many troops were under Adolf's command. So what happens here is that this shout, when Egill heard and saw Thorolf's standard going back, he felt sure that Thorolf himself would not be with it. Right, this is what a true Viking knows, that if the standard is retreating and if the enemy is shouting, it's because the enemy commander has been killed. Because there's no way a true Viking leader flees, right? And his brother, and they are the heroes of the situation. Of course, it would happen, but they were actually trained it was a terrible shame just to flee. So it's realistic they would prefer to get killed on the spot. And as we've seen, these guys were literally nuts. Like, they were berserkers. Thorolf the day before had gone full berserk and had carried out this, had already actually, as we've seen, gone along against the enemy lines. So maybe he wanted to replicate the thing the next day. Who knows? But here it doesn't speak of fury or berserker stuff and something like that, because he wasn't given the opportunity. Maybe he was caught by surprise before he could enact that. We don't know. The important thing was that Egill noticed that, so he bounded thither over the space between the two divisions. Full soon learned he the tidings of what was done when he came to his men. Then did he keenly spur them on the charge, himself foremost in the van. So here it sounds as Egill wasn't even properly in the left division. He kind of came, he was like in between the two divisions, and he joins properly the full left and commands the Viking troops from the van against the enemy. Then did he keenly spur them on the charge, himself foremost in the van, as we've seen. He had in his hand his sword Adder. So this sword that, as we've seen, he had found in Courland, and it was special. Like, they believed that they were the alter ego of the warrior altogether. Right? They thought they were magic. They were, it was a special destiny that had brought them. So he charges, right? At the head of the Vikings against the enemy. Forward Egill pressed and hewed on either hand of him, felling many men. So this is like he reaches the enemy to start massacring. Thorfinn bore the standard close after him, right? So that is important because they were literally counting on Egill himself to open a gap to the enemy line. He's just killing people. Behind the standard followed the rest. Right, so this is very, it's a bit unrealistic, of course, but the ethos emphasizes the individualism of the hero, this thing. So definitely these men, as we've seen, were dramatically, it's a bit unrealistic. This unarmored guy, even if he was kind of berserk-like, would go out there and chopping up everybody to pieces, and all the rest just following him. Formations do not work like this. You don't win battles with berserkers proper, not even if they individually do something important. That still floats on the solidity of the formation, whatever it happens, even if it's not said by the sources. But we have to imagine proper, yes, he being in the front, and in the front, as we've seen, for the solidity of the formation is everything. So you need these spearheads that throw themselves against the best of the enemy and kill each other, and who wins there starts making the enemy formation collapse altogether. Right sharp was the conflict there, so they fought as held. Egill went forward till he met Earl Adels, right? So here the duel again, this chivalric ideal. Few blows did they exchange ere Earl Adels fell, and many men around, right? So these were all the ones who would fight to the death for his commander, that, as we have seen, had achieved an important feat. The day before, he had crushed Egill, the division. Also, he had fought again in the woods, so a second fight is not a few. He had retreated. Yes, he had covered himself with shame, but the day after, he managed to surprise Thorolf and killing him, and now was fighting bravely, and so these men were faithful around him. They get killed themselves for him, and to protect him, because this was the deal. These war bands, like you think your leader is like a demigod, right? And you have to prove at every moment to be as courageous as him, and dying rather than seeing being killed, right? So. But after the Earl's death, his followers fled, right? Egill and his force pursued and slew all whom they overtook. No need there to beg quarter, right? Everybody would be massacred. Nor stood those Scotch earls long when they saw the others, their fellows, fly, but at once they took their heels. Here we're talking specifically, so you see in here properly we get the impression that Egill was fighting not against the Scots initially, but against properly Adolf's men, the Anglo-Saxons, right? So the Scots see what's going on, and as we'll see from the next passage, it seems rather than here the word it's tricky, right? Because there could have been actually two lines in this division, but as we've seen, actually the Anglo-Saxon one was concealed in the woods, right? So they were not properly deployed in the division. So these Scots that were looking here. The source says just that Egill was pushing forward. So this Adolf's men were many after all, which is a bit incoherent with the massacre of the day before. We just don't know, right? This is also just a story. But it seems as, the Scots basically are not considered as a great deal of fighters by Snorri, because they said, oh, these guys hit and run, or they don't stand the ground, so that and here even they see Adolf's men being killed, and the Scots didn't stand long, at least, when they see these other guys fly, and they took their heels. So Snorri doesn't have much of a good prejudice towards what he calls like the Scots. And as we were saying before, we don't know properly whether these were the Scots or the Hiberno-Norse or whatever, because he confuses the two leaders in of the army in one from the historical reality. And however, the source goes on and says, whereupon Egill and his men made for where the King Olaf's division was, and coming on them behind their shields soon wrought great havoc. The division wavered and broke up. Many of King Olaf's men then fled, and the Norsemen shouted shout of victory. So this is actually the clue moment, the main tactical, deal of the battle here. Basically, to make here the source is fascinating, whatever. But if we had to sum up the battle, it's literally these two divisions. These two armies clash. They have two divisions. Basically, on the Anglo-Saxon left, the Vikings win, and the Scots retreat, and then the Anglo-Saxon left, in this sense, wheels against the Allies left from their right flank, and they from its right flank, and they basically outnumbered them, and they attacked them from the flank or the rear. So they can't fight in that condition, and they break. Literally, the battle has been like this, and it's realistic and incoherent, right? It's just here the source naturally takes mostly interest in the individuality of the action and all these things, but it really gets down to this. It's also interesting in this literally 3 lines to describe this outflanking maneuver that Snorri doesn't talk about the Scots, right? So it may actually be that in this battle, if it was actually Brunanburh, whatever, all the problems here is interpretation, the Hiberno-Norse might have actually been on the left, and not under, and to be commanded by Olaf, whereas the right would have been the Scots, which may be, this we can't, I precisely know, like these Anglo-Saxon rebels under Adils and his brother, whether they would have been the ones that passed against, to the Allies side, whether they passed to the Hiberno-Norse or to the Scots, we don't know. That could solve the problem, right? But this, probably they actually passed to the Hiberno-Norse for the few that we know about the strategic situation. That is, was the Hiberno-Norse that had mostly the initiative, seemingly, on the campaign, but we can't even know properly, because even if from the battlefield, as we've seen, it's too complicated. It's really too speculative. There is no certainty of any kind. So here we just have to go with this account, and even overthinking about it, it's not really healthy, I would say. But that's really the battle. So that's why I was drawing these conclusions. Snorri says, but when King Athelstan perceived King Olaf's division beginning to break, he then spurred on his force and bade his standard advance. right? A fierce onset was made so that King Olaf's force recoiled, and there was a great slaughter, right? This is also interesting because if you read this account, it sounds as if this was yet another division, right? It's not entirely clear because we've seen that basically Egill destroyed Adil's men, and then he proceeds against Adil's men, and then proceeds against the Scots again. Then he turns to this other division of Olaf, and this wavers and breaks up. And Athelstan perceives King Olaf's division beginning to break, then he spurs his men by the standards of advance, right? And here, the source says that King Olaf's force recoiled, and that was a great slaughter. Here, I don't know about the term recoiled, how it's in the original, because is it retreated, orderly, or properly broke? Because then there is a great slaughter. So this may be actually an important detail. It may be that even in here there were maybe 2 lines in the battle. We don't know. And it sounds as if properly the Anglo-Saxon right at that point had not entered properly in combat, right? Unless here again, maybe Athelstan was in the second line, and he spurred on his force, his standard properly to advance, right? But it's probable that because this would entail that Egill's men, after having crushed the allies' right, would have basically attacked alone the enemy left, right? And then just afterwards the Anglo-Saxon on the right engaged, so as if the battle on the right had not started yet. This is not entirely clear, actually. And in the account, it sounds like two breakups, once again, of formation. So it would be also interesting to properly, because the translation term recoil would probably, the original of it would probably solve a bit this question. It's just the whole thing is still coherent, right? The enemy left is caught between 2 fires, and King Olaf fell there, which is not true because both Olaf of Dublin and Constantine II of Scotland survived battle. And this tells you how fictional or maybe how not Brunanburh this battle is. And the greater part of the force which he had, 4 of those who turned to fly, all who were overtaken were slain. Right, so here the source stresses the fact that everybody was massacred without mercy. We have already seen it on the Allies' right against Egill's men. Thus, King Athelstan gained a signal victory. Right, so this is the point. There are some slight incongruences in here with the times, the spaces, the divisions. That just prevent us the reconstruction. We don't know what Snorri had clearly in his mind, but at least in outline, it's simple enough, right? Altogether, it's military, logical, etc. And he says much more sensible things in the details, actually, than in the broader picture that he also, as we've seen, actually writes in a few lines. So I thought it would be interesting also to read Egill burying Thorolf, which is interesting in terms of military culture of the times. The next chapter says, while his men still pursued the fugitives, King Athelstan left the battlefield and rode back to the town, nor stayed he for the night before he came thither. But Egill pursued the flying foe and followed them far, slaying every man whom he overtook. This is interesting because it's as if also Athelstan left to the Vikings the loot, in part, maybe as a form of pay, right? Because also he had spent a freaking lot of money for gathering the Anglo-Saxon army altogether, so it's maybe realistic. At length stayed with pursuit, he with his followers turned back and came where the battle had been, and found there the dead body of his brother Thorolf. Alright, so, okay, this may also mean actually they were using cavalry, as we were saying before. They're just nothing strange at all. Maybe the Vikings had more cavalry than the Anglo-Saxons. Not really. Maybe it says here just King Athelstan individually came back to the camp, but other maybe pursuit, there's no way to make that proportion. He took it up, washed it, and performed such other offices as were wont of the time. They dug a grave there, and laid Thorolf therein with all his weapons and raiment. Then Egill clasped a gold bracelet on either wrist before he parted from him. This done, they heaped on stones and cast in mold. Then Egill sang a stave. The things, the bracelets are important because they're a bit like that berserker thing that we have talked when talking about the berserker and ulfvednar role in Germanic societies, that think of the rings of the chains, even sometimes in the Danish tradition, that made them, and not just in that one, in the past, all cultures that were about being possessed by the divinity. And there, naturally, these bracelets had a magic connection, especially with the dead, probably a Vodanic and Odinic practice. That's Nordic students and said, at the time, speaking of pagan times, as we've seen, these were pagans. They just accepted the cross sign because it was a way among the Anglo-Saxons, to formally accept Ethans in their army, but they could, he says it openly, still believe whatever they wanted. Then Egill sang a stave. Dauntless the doughty champion dashed on, the earl's bold slayer. In stormy stress of battle, stout-hearted Thorolf fell. Green grows on soil of wind heath, grass o'er, my noble brother. But we our woe, a sorrow, worse than death, pang must bear. And against he further sang, with warriors slain round standard, the western field I burden. Adels, with my blue adder, assailed mid-snow of war. Olaf, young prince, encountered England in battle tender. Ring stood not store of weapons, starved not the ravens mow. Then went Egill and those about him to seek King Athelstan, and at once went before the king, where he sat at the drinking. There was much noise of merriment, and when the king saw that Egill was come in, he bade the lower bench be cleared for them, and that Egill should sit in the high seat, facing the king. Egill sat down there, and cast his shield before his feet. He had his helm on his head, and laid his sword across his knees. And now again he half drew it, then clashed it back to the sheath. He sat upright, but with the head bent forward. Egill was large-featured, broad of forehead, with large eyebrows, a nose not long but very thick, lips wide and long, chin exceeding broad, as was all about the jaws. Thick-necked was he, and big-shouldered beyond other men, hard-featured and grim when angry. He was well made, more than commonly tall, and hair wolf-grey and thick, but became early bald. He was black-eyed and brown-skinned, but as he sat, as was before written, he drew one eyebrow down towards the cheek, to the other up to the roots of the hair. He wouldn't drink now, though the horn was borne to him, but alternately twitched his brows up and down. King Athelstan sat in the upper high seat. He too laid his sword across his knees. Then they had sat there for a time. Then the king drew his sword from the sheath, and took from his arms a gold ring, large and good, and placing it upon the sword point, he stood up, and went across the floor, and reached it over the fire to Egill. Egill stood up and drew his sword, and went across the floor. He stuck the sword point within the round of the ring, and drew it to him. Then he went back to his place. The king sate him again in his high seat, but when Egill was set down, he drew the ring on his arm, and then his brows went back to their place. He now laid down sword and helm, took the horn they bare to him, and drank it off. Then sang he, Mailed monarch, god of battle, make it the tinkling circlet hang, his own arm forsaking, on hawk-trod wrist of mine, a bear on arm brand wielding, bracelet of red gold gladly wore falcon's feeder, meetly finded such meed of praise. Thereafter Egill drank his share, and talked with others. Presently the king caused to be borne in 2 chests, 2 men bare each. Both were full of silver. The king said, These chests, Egill, thou shalt have, and if thou comes to Iceland, shalt carry this money to thy father. As payment for a son I send it to him, but some of the money thou shalt divide among such kinsmen of thyself and Thorolf as thou thinkest most honourable. But thou shalt make here payment for a brother with me, land or chattels, which thou wilt. And if thou wilt abide with me long, then I will give thee honour and dignity, such as thyself mayst name. Egill took the money and thanked the king for his gifts and friendly words. Thenceforward Egill began to be cheerful, and then he sang, in sorrow sadly drooping, sank my brows close knitted. Then I found I one who furrows of forehead could smooth, fierce frowning cliffs that shaded my face, a king hath lifted, with gleam of golden armlet, gloom livid my eyes. That is to say, yeah, you just massacred an incredible number of human beings. Your brother is dead, you're exhausted, and you're pissed off by the whole situation, but you see gold and say, oh, okay, yeah, now I feel good. Right, this is literally the status that these people had, because it was a huge honor, of course, to receive a gift from a king, from such powerful one, etc. So this was surely an important event altogether, and but he wanted the reward for it. This is the point, and he got it. So then those men were healed, whose wounds left hope of life, by the way, because most of them would die, as you know, of septicemia mostly, and so you can't. So these people were still not yet even, yeah, they would drink, even knowing maybe they would die. Egill abode with King Athelstan for the next winter after Thorolf's death, and had very great honor from the king. With Egill was then all that force which had followed the two brothers and come alive out of the battle. Egill now made a poem about King Athelstan, and in it is this stave: Land shielder, battle quickener, lo now this Sion royal earl's tree hath laid. To Ella earth must obedient bow, lavish of gold, king glorious, great Athelstan victorious, surely is where all humbled to such high monarch yells. But this is the burden in the poem: reindeer through the hills obey, bold Athelstan's high sway. Then gave Athelstan further to Egill as poets meet 2 gold rings, each weighing a mark, and therewith a costly cloak, and the king himself late formerly worn. But when spring came, Egill signified to King this, that he purposed to go away in the summer to Norway, and to learn how matters stand with Asgard, my late brother Thorolf's wife. A large property is there in all, but I know not whether there be children of theirs living. I'm bound to look after them if they live, but I'm heir to all if Thorolf died childless. The king answered, this will be Egill for you to arrange to go away, hence if you think you have an errand of duty, but I think 'twere the best way that you should settle down here with me on such terms as you like to ask. It is important from Athelstan to settle these troops, these mercenaries, to make them, having seen how effective they were on the field, to settle them, to make them his own as for further wars, etc. So Egill thanked the king for his words. I will, he said, now first go, as I am in duty bound to do, but it is likely that I shall return hither to see after this promise so soon as I can. The king bade him to do so. Whereupon Egill made him ready to depart with his men, but of these many remained behind with the king. Egill had one large war ship, and on board thereof 100 men of thereabouts. And when he was ready for his voyage, and a fair wind blew, he put out to sea. He and King Athelstan parted with great friendship. The king begged Egill to return as soon as possible. Again, this Egill promised to do so. Then Egill stood for Norway, and when he came to land, sailed with all speed into the firth. He heard these tidings that Lord Thorir was dead, and Arinbjorn had taken inheritance after him and was made a baron. Egill went to Arinbjorn and got there a good welcome. Arinbjorn asked him to stay there. Egill accepted this, and his ship set up, and his crew lodged. But Arinbjorn received Egill and 12 men. They stayed with him through the winter, whatever. So, about the battle, as we've seen, it's really, from Snorri's account, it's really simple altogether. Aside from this minor problems of realizing who was, how the divisions were actually composed, who fought through what at some point. But the dynamic is really simple, and I think we don't have to repeat it. I would say the battle Brunanburh has this fascination of this because of the mystery revolving around it. I was glad to talk about it. I hope that we will discover more at some point. Maybe finding the battlefield would be one of the greatest British dreams, I guess. And surely we will talk anyway on Schwerpunkt more about the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings, the Hiberno-Norse, the Scots, because that's all an area that we have to explore largely. And I'm glad I could talk more about this also recently, and we will surely keep to do so. It's an important battle to be documented, a very significant one, one that shows you so much actually, more through the details than even through the substance of the sources, about what this thing was about. And I think, this is all. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.